In the last couple of years, a lot of legendary manga have ended, and every single time, the final chapter made people go crazy, which makes sense. You follow a series for years, and the journey ends with those final 20 pages. But what's the difference between a final chapter that gets this reaction and a final chapter that gets this reaction? Fullmetal Alchemist is an absolute classic. For nearly a decade, readers followed Edward and Alphonse's journey to get back their bodies after a horrible accident. It started as this simple quest to find the Philosopher's Stone, but slowly evolved into something way bigger than that. In the last arc, the stakes were huge. The main villain was trying to become a literal god. Fullmetal Alchemist was on a generational run. But unlike a lot of long-running manga that kind of feel like they're making stuff up as they go, this manga was always building towards something specific, finding their bodies. The final chapter reaches its absolute peak when Edward has to make this impossible choice. To save his brother's soul, he must give away alchemy forever. As in, the thing he spent his entire life mastering. Both of them become regular people and start traveling the world, not to become stronger, but to help people. Edward even gets this, little awkward romantic moment that shows how much he's grown, which was very cute, I'm not gonna lie. And the response was absolutely awesome. Fans were extremely happy with how the final chapter concluded their favorite story. To this day, Fullmetal Alchemist is remembered not just as a great manga, but as this complete experience where everything was resolved. And not only is it always mentioned when talking about series with great endings, it's widely considered as one of the greatest manga of all time. Combined with the fact that the anime was the highest rated anime of all time for a very long while, the legacy of Fullmetal Alchemist is solid. But sometimes the final chapter is a sad ending. In 2012, Yusei Matsui created what might be one of the weirdest stories in manga history. What if a bunch of middle school students had to assassinate their octopus alien teacher before he destroys the entire planet? That kind of sounds like the dumbest concept imaginable, but Assassination Classroom quickly transformed into something genuinely emotional for the readers. It became a story about education where this weird alien was suddenly the best freaking teacher anyone could imagine, helping these kids who had basically completely failed in life. From the very first chapter, we always knew that Assassination Classroom was going to end in one possible way: the destruction of teacher Kuro-sensei. But by the time the final chapter arrived, no one wanted that to happen because of how cool the story was and how attached we were to these characters. Right before the end, the students gather around their teacher, and in his last moments, Kuro-sensei does what he always did best. He teaches. He calls out each student's name with pure pride and love. The final chapter happens after a time skip. We see the entire class thriving as adults, carrying Kuro-sensei's lessons and values into their future. They've all achieved their goals and became good people, and the main character carries Kuro-sensei's legacy by becoming a teacher himself. After this happened, fans were so freaking happy. Many people said that they cried through the entire final chapter, while others said it was phenomenal and made total sense with the entire story. This series has less than 200 chapters, which feels perfect. It wasn't too short, and it didn't stay longer than it had to. The ending is often talked about as one of the rare shonen conclusions that landed perfectly without ruining anything that came before it. It tied everything together in a package that makes Assassination Classroom a classic. But here's the thing. Not every final chapter feels like it makes sense with the rest of the story. Attack on Titan is a manga about humanity's fight for survival against these terrifying man-eating titans. And let me tell you right now, this series became a freaking worldwide phenomenon that dominated anime and manga for over a decade. I mean, to this day, a lot of people say that this is one of the main reasons anime and manga have become more mainstream. It would be way too complicated to explain the whole thing, but basically, the last arc is when the main character, Eren, starts this thing called the Rumbling. He unleashes hundreds of these colossal titans to destroy pretty much the entire world. And while this is happening, his friends form an alliance to stop him, leading to the series finale when Eren is defeated. In the final chapter, he explains why he did everything he did to Armin, his best friend. My man reveals that he had planned all of this, pushing away his friends and making himself into this hated enemies so they could become humanity's heroes by stopping him. On top of the final chapter, we also get these extra pages that showed all this cycle of war starting again and again. And trust me, this time readers were not happy. They felt like they had read this massive, epic story for years just for the final chapter to be super short and kinda hard to understand. The reaction was explosive in ways that split the fan base forever. People argued that the ending felt kinda rushed and super inconsistent with everything that had come before. Aaron's revelations just felt really weird to a lot of fans. They complained that the way he acted was really cringe and it was widely made fun of because it turned this complex character into this boy. Yeah, the backlash was so intense that the author actually received online attacks and publicly apologized, admitting he still had genuine doubts about whether he did the right thing. He even explained what his real intentions were for the ending. Luckily, years later, the anime ending changed most of the things that fans didn't love about the final chapter, and it's now considered the real ending. So even though the final chapter of the manga was super controversial, this has solidified its legacy as another classic. With Attack on Titan, it felt like the final chapter was going to be amazing, but sometimes it's almost impossible to have a good final chapter. Haikyuu is the story of Hinata Shoyo, a short but passionate dude who becomes completely obsessed with volleyball. He quickly builds this rivalry with a guy called Kageyama that plays in the same team as him. And so, over 400 chapters, Haikyuu becomes the journey of their volleyball team, but also every other rival team and their own struggles. Before the final chapter, we get this arc showing a lot of characters that we've met throughout the story. Now, they're professional players competing against each other. Hinata has developed his volleyball skills and his maturity as a person after a massive defeat in high school. At this point, Haikyuu had a similar problem to a lot of other manga. There were just so many characters and stories that it felt almost impossible for the final chapter to tie all this together in a satisfying way. And then it happened. The final chapter shows some of these players once again, but this time we see them playing for the Japanese national team and face off against Argentina. This professional match represents everything these guys have been working on for years. On top of that, the final chapter also shows us what happened to almost all the other characters, including those who didn't become professional players. The final message of the series is a simple explanation of the rule. Two teams separated by a net bounce the ball back and forth. The ball is not allowed to touch the floor, cannot be carried once in the air. A team has no more than 3 touches to connect and take the ball from receive to attack, which ends with the final panel. Hinata and Kageyama facing each other once again. And fans freaking loved the way the final chapter ended this series. And in my opinion, they weren't wrong. Listen, one of the biggest strengths of Haikyuu is how it developed almost every character, even the smallest, randomest ones. And that is also how it ended, by showing almost every single character, at least a little bit. Readers were super happy that they got to see Hinata's growth from a kid who could jump high but didn't have any skills to a complete professional player, which is a beautiful way to show the hard work message of the story. People were especially happy that it didn't end with some crazy high school victory that would have felt kinda meh. Characters moved on, evolved, found new dreams and goals just like real people do when they graduate. It didn't make you feel like the only winners were the ones that became professional players. The final chapter strongly contributed to Haikyuu's legacy as the best modern sports manga, if not the best sports manga of all time. But what if I told you that for some reason, another final chapter had the complete opposite effect? Here's the thing. I never actually read Tokyo Revengers, so if I say anything silly or wrong, please just let me know in the comments. But to be honest, after hearing about everything I'm about to tell you, I don't really want to read it anymore. Listen, the reason I wanted to talk about this series is because when it ended, even if you didn't know anything about it, if you were at least a little bit into anime or manga, you knew how much people hated it. It got so bad that the freaking author was being attacked by fans online, which is insane. I can't believe that I'm about to say this, but after a while, the author started a new manga called Astro Royale, and people hated Tokyo Revengers' final chapter so much that they continued to hate on this new series even though it had literally nothing to do with Tokyo Revengers. And yeah, it wasn't that good, but it definitely wasn't as bad as the fans were saying. But it got canceled, so Tokyo Revengers was amazing for a while. But nowadays, it's seen as one of the biggest downfalls in manga history, and the author is still recovering from his infamous final chapter. Now that we're done with these guys, we can start looking at a very special category of final chapters, the war arc final chapters. characters. Let me show you what I mean. When Tite Kubo wrote Bleach back in 2001, it was this incredible mix of supernatural action and style that absolutely freaking exploded in popularity. The series followed Ichigo Kurosaki, this teenager who accidentally becomes a Soul Reaper, basically a dude who fights monsters and bad guys. The aesthetics of this series made Bleach the cool kid of the legendary Big Three alongside Naruto and One Piece. By the time we reached its last arc, serious problems started and fans were genuinely worried. The author introduced literally dozens of new characters and set up a bunch of subplots. This arc had to be the series' grand finale and to give readers answers to questions that had been building for over a decade. However, behind the scenes, Kubo was struggling a lot. Things were happening faster and faster, with really important fights ending in just a couple of chapters. Parts of the story that seemed incredibly important were just dropped, and big mysteries got these unsatisfying explanations that felt very rushed. Before the finale, many readers were already afraid of an incomplete ending. But then, the final chapter jumped several years in time, showing this peaceful scene. Ichigo is married with a son, and his friends are also married and have a daughter. Everything is peaceful and everyone is happy. It was pretty cool, but fans could sense that something was seriously wrong. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative. For years after this, Bleach's ending basically became a fandom punchline for disappointment and rushed conclusions. Fans pointed out that a lot of plot points were just abandoned, and the finale felt extremely rushed rather than planned or satisfying. Even readers who understood Kubo's struggles and the pressure he was under felt kinda let down. On top of that, many people felt like that final chapter was just the cherry on top. For a while, the manga was basically kind of forgotten, and many people even said that it shouldn't have been in the Big Three. But here's the cool part. The recent 1000-Year Blood War anime adaptation of the manga has been on a generational run. They've been adding new scenes and fleshing out battles that were short in the manga. This has given some fans hope that the story might finally receive the conclusion it deserved all along. And slowly, Bleach is starting to rebuild its legacy as one of the members of the legendary Big Three. Maybe an even better legacy than some other members of the Big Three. When I was growing up, Naruto was one of the biggest series out there. It's the story of a kid who wants to prove that even the most hated, most rejected person can become great. And to do that, his plan is to become Hokage, which is kinda like a president. For years, Naruto was this cultural phenomenon and one of the Big Three shonen that literally defined an entire generation of manga readers around the world. It was on its way to becoming one of the GOATs. But one day, when the series reached the 4th Great Ninja War arc, serious problems began to show. The whole thing started as a war between all the ninja Naruto had met throughout the story and the bad guys. A lot of fans were already kind of struggling with this part until they got to the final battle, which they absolutely hated. It was this weird fight between an ancient alien lady and all the main characters. Eventually, fans did get the final battle they were waiting for between the two main characters of the series, but at this point, it was already too late. The final chapter jumped years into the future. Naruto was married with 2 children. But here's the thing. Nearly every single character was also married with children, which created this next generation that was clearly being set up for a future series. The chapter was a peaceful ending, focused on everyday life, showing the new generation playing together, everyone was happy, and the world was finally at peace. And of course, Naruto had finally achieved his dream of becoming Hokage. For a lot of fans, something felt wrong about the whole thing. The reaction was super divisive. Supporters loved seeing their favorite characters happy and settled after years of growth. But many people argued that too many things happened at the same time. There was the chaos of the war, then the final fight against an alien and all these characters that just didn't get the development they deserved. Fans also thought that the relationships felt extremely forced and that there had only been a couple of couples that actually made sense. It was almost like right after one of the most mediocre arcs of the series, people got a resolution that felt nice, but didn't fully make sense. Like it came out of absolutely nowhere. To this day, most Naruto fans agree that the final arc of the series is the worst one. Combined with the fact that the final chapter didn't really help, it was a pretty bad combo. But here's the crazy part. Even though the situation is very similar to Bleach's, the way people feel about these two series is very different nowadays. Naruto has this really complicated legacy that's still being debated today. It's still a huge manga that influenced a lot of readers, but it's often talked about with this sense of, it was great until the end happened. But weirdly enough, nowadays the sequel, Boruto, is getting so much hate that people have gone from having a sour taste about Naruto to actually thinking things were not that bad. Surely this war arc final chapter was only a problem a bunch of years ago, right? My Hero Academia is the story of a world where almost everyone has these powers called quirks, except for Deku, who was born without powers, until the world's greatest hero basically offers him his abilities. When it came out, MHA felt like this genuinely fresh take on superhero stories, and for years a lot of people were even calling it this generation's Naruto. We were slowly introduced to new heroes and new villains over hundreds of chapters. We followed Deku on his journey to become the greatest hero until we got to the last arc. This part of the series threw literally every character into this massive war with battles happening in a bunch of different places at the same time. Deku faced the main villain in this absolutely crazy fight. The good guys win, and we get the final chapter. Once again, we jump years later to see how heroes rebuild society after the war. Deku loses his powers and becomes a teacher, but he gets an Iron Man suit, so he can actually still kind of be a hero. We get to see where most of the characters are and how well they're doing as heroes, including how they're ranked. One of the characters starts a program to help people in need and reduce the number of villains, which works. This society completely changes, which means that there are way less villains, but also way less heroes, and everything gets resolved. Everyone gets their moment, and society moves forward in a positive direction. It genuinely seemed like the final chapter did a decent job, but fans were not happy. Many people felt like the final arc's pacing was rushed, and that a bunch of storylines didn't receive the development they deserved after years of buildup. The insane number of characters made it feel like there was just too much going on. People complained that the final chapter felt emotionally flat, and weirdly enough, a lot of people also complained that certain characters weren't in relationships. If you remember what I said about Naruto, this doesn't really make sense because this final chapter actually didn't make a lot of the mistakes these series made. Which brings me to something that made this final chapter a little unusual. My Hero Academia is a series that's famous for one of the most wild fandoms out there. Nowadays, even though a lot of people admit the final chapter wasn't even that bad, MHA's legacy still feels like it hasn't fully recovered. The anime is a freaking banger though. But sometimes there are authors who manage to pull off the final chapter following a war arc in a very different way. Mob Psycho 100 was written by One, the same dude who created One Punch Man. Where a lot of other manga have characters that want to get stronger, Mob Psycho 100 treats supernatural abilities as this thing that kind of prevents the main character from expressing his emotions and just being a regular kid. Over the entire story, we watch him fight a bunch of spirits, but we also watch him grow as a person. In the final arc, a car accident triggers his powers and he destroys everything in his way while not being able to control himself. That's because his emotions manifest as this different version of him, and he just starts destroying the city while no one can stop him. Until his mentor Reagan, the guy with like no psychic abilities whatsoever, admits his own flaws and tells Mob he doesn't need to fight himself anymore. He doesn't need to suppress who he really is. He just needs to accept all parts of himself, even the scary ones. After all that, we get to the final chapter. We see Mob in his next school year, but he feels like a completely different person. He's genuinely happy with who he is, and even though he was a really awkward dude, he made a bunch of friends. There's even the small moment where he saves a cat not with his incredible psychic powers, but by physically climbing up to help it like a normal person. The final panel shows him with this big, genuine smile, which is something we see for the very first time in the entire series. Readers praised this ending for being simple and beautiful, unlike most manga endings out there. One had created something genuinely rare, a final chapter that tied everything together in a way that made perfect sense. People were calling it a satisfying conclusion to a crazy story that never betrays what the series was actually about. And to this day, even though One is mostly known for One Punch Man, Mob Psycho 100 might actually be his genuine masterpiece, and is kinda considered an underrated gem. But if we're talking War Arc final chapters, the most controversial one goes to one specific series. Jujutsu Kaisen is this dark modern twist on battle manga. It's one of these series that was being praised as this new generation masterpiece that was going to redefine manga for years. It had an extremely complex power system, really iconic characters, and some of the most legendary fights in manga history. As the series started getting closer to its conclusion, things also started changing. The last arc was basically this all-out war between the good guys and the one main bad guy. And for a while, it was genuinely the peak of this story. Every single fan was 100% invested in every single new chapter. But the more chapters came out, the more there were leaks, fan arguments, crazy decisions that had people questioning whether the author actually knew what they were doing. The most shocking moment came when Satoru Gojo, who is basically the most popular character of the series, was slain in a way that felt rushed for a lot of people. After all of this fighting, the battle concluded with the protagonist ultimately defeating the main villain. The final chapter showed society just moving forward with the main character continuing his work, but the tone was much calmer. The characters were happy, and even the big bad guy had a moment where he said he would do things differently if he had the chance. And you know what? Personally, I thought that, yeah, that last fight was a bit rushed, but the ending was pretty decent. But holy moly, the fans were mad. First of all, as usual, a lot of people said the worst things to the author online. Are we still wondering why manga authors want to be anonymous? Many people were genuinely calling it the worst ending in modern manga history, which, I'm kind of getting the impression that this is what every manga ending is called nowadays. Fans felt like the last arc was extremely chaotic and that several plot lines that had been introduced and developed throughout the series either ended ambiguously or just were not addressed at all. And on top of that, they were very upset that the final chapter didn't really help. Jujutsu Kaisen is now in a very weird place where it has amazing execution for most of the run, followed by a pretty chaotic war arc and final chapter. It's the kind of thing where it was so close to being absolutely perfect, which is kind of sad because JJK was like the next big thing for a long time. But nowadays, the community is pretty split. Luckily, the author has started writing a new series, which is the continuation, so we'll have to see what happens. And in some very rare cases, no one expects the final chapter to be the final chapter. Kentaro Miura began Berserk almost 40 years ago. It was this really dark story of a dude called Guts who tries to destroy a bunch of evil demons. But it quickly evolved into something way more profound and beautiful. It became a story about whether meaning and hope can exist in a world that seems defined by pure pain. Across 3 freaking decades, Guts' journey became legendary enough to earn the title of best manga of all time. Miura's perfectionism and deep love of the art infused every single panel, making Berserk not just a story, but this visual masterpiece that influenced countless creators and redefined what manga could achieve in every single way. At some point, the story got to this arc where Guts and his friends finally found safety after literal decades of struggling. For the first time in the entire series, these characters experienced genuine calm. The tone had softened a lot. We knew that a battle against the big boss was going to happen, but at this moment, it felt like the characters had earned some rest. Chapter 364 was filled with these heartwarming scenes that feel almost surreal for Berserk. Guts had these quiet moments, and his friends were having fun with the mysterious Moonlight Boy in a really cozy atmosphere. The chapter shows the characters genuinely enjoying the situation, with Guts actually smiling, which, trust me, is super rare. The chapter ends with this crazy reveal that's shocking and kind of perfect. The Moonlight Boy transforms back into the main villain, Griffith, with a single tear on his cheek. It's ambiguous, haunting, and just a massive cliffhanger. But when it was over, no one knew that chapter 364 would become Miura's final gift to the world before he unexpectedly passed away. The reception of Miura's final chapter was extremely emotional in ways that go beyond usual manga reactions. Knowing this was Miura's last gift to his readers, fans were extremely grateful for what they'd been given all these years. Many people were happy that Miura had left them with a finale that perfectly captured Berserk's entire emotional range. Horror and beauty all wrapped up in one beautiful chapter. The final panel, Single Tear, has become this perfect symbol for the series itself. In terms of legacy, Berserk is still releasing chapters here and there, but Miura's final chapter was completely unexpected. It symbolizes this beautiful farewell by an author who poured his entire soul into his work. And instead of hurting the series' reputation, the lack of a traditional ending might have actually strengthened Berserk's status as a timeless masterpiece.